On March 30th, 1867, a signature was placed on a document that changed the map of the world forever. The price, $7.2 million. The item sold, Alaska, a territory equal in size to 1/5 of Europe, a land beneath whose ice and mountains lie gold, oil, and gas worth trillions of dollars. It was sold for just 2 cents per acre, one of the loudest and most controversial deals in the world history. But behind the dry number lies a far deeper story, a story of geopolitical intrigue, reckless ambition, and bitter illusions. Why did Russian Empire decide to give up such a land? Did America really buy a chest of ice as newspapers mocked at that time? Did the Russians understand what they were losing? And did the Americans truly grasp what they were gaining? And most importantly, a century and a half later, who was right, the seller or the buyer? We will trace Alaska's entire journey, from the first Russian ships reaching its shores to gold rushes and oil rigs. We will dismantle the myth, uncover the real motives, and calculate the true price of this deal. You're watching KISS. We bring you a different angle on the stories you care about. If you enjoy deep, well-researched history, subscribe to the channel. Like the video, share it with someone who loves history. It will help us to make more interesting videos just for you. Before we can understand why Alaska was sold, we need to understand what it actually was. Imagine a place where nature is not merely majestic, it is overwhelming, where ice and fire collide in an endless confrontation. This is not just a state, it is a continent in miniature. Its Aleut name, Alaska, means the Great Land or the mainland. And that is not exaggeration. This is realm of extremes. Its total area is 1.7 square kilometers, about 656,000 square miles. The largest state in the United States, bigger than Texas, California, and Montana combined. A vast mainland and thousands of islands washed by two oceans, Pacific and Arctic. From its southern archipelago stretched the narrow Alaska Peninsula, 700 kilometers long, a dagger pointed straight into the heart of the Pacific Ocean. A mountainous land with dozens of volcanoes, more than in all other US states combined. Kodiak Island, the second largest island in the United States after Hawaii. And ice. Glaciers cover over 41,000 square kilometers, about 16,000 square miles. To put that into perspective, that is the entire territory of the Netherlands, an entire European country locked in ice. But beneath that ice and among those mountains, life thrived. For thousands of years, dozens of indigenous people lived here. The Aleut, master hunters of the sea. The Inuit adapted to the frozen coastlines. The warlike Tlingit tribes. Their world was built on a fragile balance with nature, rich in fish and game. Their greatest treasure was fur, especially the sea otter. Its dense, water-repellent coat was soft gold, a currency that would determine the fate of this land for the next century. The signs of future greatness were already there. Gold scattered in riverbands, oil seeping naturally to the surface. But in the mid-19th century, gold was seen as a troublesome curiosity, and oil was used mainly as a dubious remedy for stomach ailments. The true value of this land lay in a future no one could yet imagine. And it was here, to this harsh, distant, and astonishingly rich frontier, that the first ships flying the double-headed eagle arrived in the 18th century. How did they get here? And what compelled them to remain at the very edge of the known world? So, who was the first to reveal this land to the world? The discovery of Alaska was not a single heroic act, but a chain of coincidences, tragedies, and scientific persistence stretched across nearly 2 centuries. As early as 1648, the Cossack explorer Semyon Dezhnev, along with his companions, is believed to have sailed through the strait separating Asia and America, but his report was lost in Siberian archives. His journey went unrecognized, and the world learned nothing. The discovery existed, but only on paper no one ever read. Nearly 80 years passed before the idea resurfaced, and this time it came from a man who thought in global terms, Peter the Great. The instincts of a great reformer told him that something crucial lay at the eastern edge of his empire. Just weeks before his death in 1725, Peter personally signed a decree launching the first Kamchatka expedition. Its leader was a Dane in Russian service, Vitus Bering. The mission was simple in wording, but enormous in consequence, to determine whether Asia and America were connected. In 1728, Bering's ship, the St. Gabriel, sailed through the very strait that would later bear his name, but the region's infamous fog concealed the American shore. A disciplined and methodical officer, Bering refused to claim a discovery without irrefutable proof. Evidence mattered more than glory. That proof arrived 4 years later, in 1732, an expedition aboard the same St. Gabriel, led by surveyor Mikhail Gvozdev and navigator Ivan Fedorov, sighted the Alaskan coast and became the first documented Europeans to set foot on Alaskan soil, on the Diomede Islands. It was a quiet moment, no flags, no proclamation, but it was the first recorded human step into a new chapter of history. The true breakthrough, however, the moment that permanently placed Alaska on the world map, came with the Great Northern Expedition, the largest and most expensive scientific undertaking in 18th century Russian history. In the summer of 1741, the packet ship St. Peter, commanded by Bering, and St. Paul under Alexei Chirikov set out in search of American coast. The results were extraordinary. For the first time, the vast arc from Kamchatka to Alaska was mapped in detail. The Aleutian Islands, the Commander Islands, and the southern coast of Alaska were discovered and charted. The existence of the strait between Asia and America was conclusively proven, and the absence of any unknown lands between them confirmed. The expedition produced the first scientific descriptions of local flora, fauna, and even the cultures of indigenous peoples. But these discoveries came at terrible cost. On the return voyage, disaster struck the St. Peter. Scurvy swept through the crew. The ship, filled with dying men, lost all control and became a drifting coffin. In November 1741, it was wrecked on the shore of a barren, rocky island. Bering, gravely ill, died there in a makeshift dugout, half buried in sand for warmth. The island would later bear his name. It seemed like the end. But the 40 survivors did the impossible. They endured the winter, and in the summer of 1742, using the wreckage of St. Peter, they built a tiny vessel barely 12 meters long. And here comes the moment that changed everything. Before setting sail, they loaded the boat to the brim with the sea otter pelts. The fur, incredibly dense, water-repellent, and unlike anything seen before, carried them back to Kamchatka. News of their return spread across the world. The pelts they brought were judged to be the finest fur on Earth. The Geography Department of the St. Petersburg Academy of Science published a sensational map of the discoveries. Europe's great powers, especially Britain, rushed to reprint it under the title The Russian Discoveries. But more powerful than maps were the stories. The survivors spoke of the Aleutian Islands and Alaska's shores as places teeming with these animals, this soft gold. Their words ignited a true fur rush. Hundreds of hunters and fortune seekers floated toward the new territories in search of quick wealth. The official age of exploration was over. A private, reckless, and often brutal era of conquest had begun. And so, through tragedy, chance, and the irresistible value of fur, Alaska became Russian America. But at what cost? And what unfolded in this harsh new world where a handful of newcomers collided with entire civilization that had lived here for thousands of years? This is how Russian America appeared on the world map. But what happened on this land after the celebratory salutes of discovery faded away? The reality was far removed from romance. Let's begin with the numbers. When the Russians arrived, Alaska and Aleutian Islands were home by various estimates to 80,000 to 100,000 people. Dozens of indigenous nations lived here: Alus, Inuit Inupiat peoples, and Tlingit Indians. They were hunters, fishers, and gatherers with some sophisticated cultures, perfectly adapted to one of the harshest environments on Earth. And how many Russians were there? At the height of the colony's development in the 1830s, the Russian population numbered about 780 people, fewer than 1,000 newcomers controlling a territory the size of 1/5 of Europe. How was that even possible? The answer lies in three forces: firearms, disease, and a brutal system of control. From the very beginning, relations were built on coercion rather than coexistence. Indigenous communities faced not only unfamiliar people, but unfamiliar diseases: smallpox, measles, influenza, against which they had no immunity. The result was catastrophic. By the mid-19th century, Alaska's indigenous population had declined by approximately 80%. On some Aleutian Islands, mortality reached 90%. It was a demographic collapse, tragically echoing the fate of indigenous peoples across the Americas. To control the surviving population, Russian traders used a system known as amanstva, hostage-taking. Children or relatives of tribal leaders were seized to guarantee obedience and the steady delivery of fur tribute. Failure to meet quotas could result in torture or execution of the hostages. In 1799, Emperor Paul I formalized this system. All indigenous peoples were declared subjects of the Russian Empire. Forced Christianization followed. Children were taken into schools where they were stripped of their language and traditions, trained instead of civilized laborers for colonial needs. In practice, indigenous Alaskans became serfs of a monopoly corporation. That corporation was unlike any other. Also, in 1799, Irkutsk merchants, heirs to the enterprises of Grigory Shelikhov and Alexander Baranov, established the Russian-American Company. It was granted far more than commercial privileges. This was a state within a state. The company held a monopoly on all trade and resource extraction. It could found settlements, maintain its own fleet, and deploy armed forces. From a business perspective, it was brutally efficient. For years, the Russian-American Company was the most profitable enterprise in the Russian Empire. At its peak, its annual revenues reached the equivalent of nearly 20 million modern US dollars. So what did it trade? Soft gold. Sea otter pelts were the crown jewel. Traded in China for tea, silk, and silver, they formed a transcontinental road: Alaska, Okhotsk, Kakhta, St. Petersburg. Whalebone and whale oil, essential for car seats, umbrellas, and industrial lubricants. Ice. Yes, ice was big business. Massive blocks of pristine Alaskan ice were cut and shipped to San Francisco and other Pacific ports to preserve food, alongside fish, timber, and coal. And this brings us to a crucial myth. It is often said that Russia sold Alaska without knowing how rich it was. That is not true. Gold was discovered in Alaska as early as 1848, 2 decades before the sale, but the deposits appeared poor and extraction was extremely labor-intensive. The company focused on fast profits from fur, abandoned geological exploration. The famous gold rush would come later under American rule. Oil was known as well. Surface sea pages had been recorded even by members of Bering's expeditions, but in the mid-19th century, oil was little more than a folk remedy for stomach ailments or fuel for kerosene lamps. No one yet understood its strategic value. The idea that the ground concealed hundreds of billions of dollars worth of black gold would have sounded insane to people of that era. To supply the remote colony with food and materials, the Russians moved south. In 1812, just 80 kilometers north of Spanish San Francisco, they founded Fort Ross. It became the southernmost outpost of Russian America, an agricultural and shipbuilding base, but it never turned a profit. In 1841, Fort Ross was sold. Despite monopoly control, relations with indigenous peoples remain volatile. That linked a powerful and well-organized nation repeatedly rebelled. The largest uprising occurred in 1802 when they destroyed the Russian settlement on Sitka Island. Rebuilding it and exacting revenge took 2 years and required naval artillery. The reasons were simple: unfair prices, violence, and the determination to defend their land and way of life. And then everything began to unravel. The Russian-American Company was built on predatory exploitation. Sea otters, the foundation of its wealth, were hunted to near extinction. By the 1840s, the soft gold was gone. The population has never fully recovered. The sea otter remains a protected species to this day. At the same time, competitors entered the market. Britain's Hudson Bay Company and American traders offered indigenous hunters modern rifles and goods the Russians could not provide. The monopoly collapsed. By the mid-1850s, the most profitable company in the empire was effectively bankrupt. Its debts to the Russian state exceeded 700,000 gold rubles. Instead of filling the treasury, Alaska now drained it. And this was only part of the problem. Far more dangerous storms were gathering on geopolitical horizon. What forced St. Petersburg to urgently rid itself of a vast, if troubled, territory? Why did the sale become a matter not of profit, but of survival? And what role did the distant Crimean War and the looming shadow of the British Empire play in this decision? By the mid-19th century, Alaska had stopped being a cash cow. But why did Russia choose not merely to abandon it, but to sell it, and to do so urgently? The answer lies not only in the empty warehouses of the Russian-American company, but in a fundamental shift in imperial priorities. While some in St. Petersburg still looked across the ocean, others were looking much closer, toward the Far East. Between 1858 and 1860, Russia signed the treaties of Aigun and Beijing with China, annexing vast new territories, the Amur region and Primorye. These lands bordered the Russian heartland directly. They had a far milder climate than Alaska and, crucially, access to ice-free ports. This is where resources, administrative talent, and imperial attention were now concentrated. Alaska, by contrast, slipped to the very edge of imperial consciousness, and for good reason. To understand why, we need to imagine what managing Russian America actually meant. The journey from central Russia to Alaska was not travel, it was a multi-year survival expedition.
In spring, a traveler would leave Moscow heading east, changing horses every 100 versts. By July, he reached the Urals. In August, he crossed the Ob River. With the first snow, he arrived in Irkutsk. Then came winter, sleds along the frozen Lena River to Yakutsk, where he was forced to wait out the spring floods. Only in June of the following year could he continue, by reindeer sled, and by autumn finally reached Kamchatka, just in time to winter there again. And only the next summer, more than 2 years after departure, would he finally arrive in Alaska, collect the cargo of furs, and repeat the entire ordeal in reverse.
Running a colony on the other side of the planet with communication taking a year and military support too was not merely difficult. In the event of the war, it was suicidal, and war was no abstraction. In 1853, the Governor-General of Eastern Siberia, Count Nikolai Muravyev-Amursky, submitted a now famous memorandum to Emperor Nicholas I. Its conclusion was harsh and pragmatic. Alaska would inevitably be lost. Why?
The dominance of the United States of North America over the entirety of North America is so natural that we should hardly even regret that 25 years ago, we did not establish ourselves in California, for sooner or later, we would have been forced to relinquish it anyway. Had we done so peacefully, we might at least have obtained other advantages from the Americans in return. Moreover, now, with the invention and development of railroads, even more than before, one must be convinced of the inevitability that the United States will expand across all of North America. And we cannot ignore the fact that sooner or later we will be compelled to yield our North American possessions to them.
Muravyev-Amursky, the architect of Russia's expansion into Amur region, was pointing to an unmistakable trend. A young, aggressive America, having already purchased Louisiana and seized Texas, was methodically rounding out its territory. Alaska was the next logical step. Holding it against the will of the United States was something Russia would be physically incapable of doing. The conclusion was clear. Russia had to secure its position on the Asian shore of the Pacific and divest itself of its American asset while it still had any value. Then came the Crimean War. Between 1853 and 1856, Russia suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. The war drained the treasury, exposed technological backwardness, and most critically revealed how vulnerable Russia's distant frontiers truly were. British ships did not attack only Sevastopol. They operated in the Pacific as well, attempting landings on Kamchatka. The message was clear. In the event of another war with Britain, Alaska would be seized instantly by land from British Canada and by sea. Defending it was impossible. Alaska had transformed from an asset into a strategic liability, a burden, a weakness, a hole in the empire's defenses. Meanwhile, Russia's finances were in ruins. After the Crimean War, the budget deficit exceeded 265 million rubles, over 200 million US dollars in modern terms. Emperor Alexander II, just beginning his great reforms, including the abolition of serfdom, was desperate for funds. He sought foreign loans totaling 42 million rubles. In that context, maintaining a distant, unprofitable colony appeared not just impractical, but irresponsible. And here, the final piece of the geopolitical puzzle fell into place. Russia's primary enemy after the Crimean War remained Great Britain. What it needed was a counterweight, an ally with similar interests. And that ally stood across the Atlantic. Selling Alaska to Washington solved several problems at once. It brought in much-needed cash, it removed an indefensible territory, and it straightened ties with Britain's natural geopolitical rival. In 1957, just 1 year after the Crimean War ended, Alexander II's younger brother, Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich, put the logic bluntly in a letter to the foreign minister.
This sale would be most timely. We must not deceive ourselves. The United States, striving constantly to round out their possessions and to dominate North America entirely, will eventually take these colonies from us, and we will not be able to reclaim them. Meanwhile, these colonies bring us very little benefit, and their loss would not be especially painful.
Alexander II read the letter and wrote a short resolution in the margin, one that sealed the fate of an entire continent. This idea is worth considering. The decision was made at the highest levels. All that remained was to find the right moment and a buyer willing to purchase what many called a chest of ice. But how do you persuade an American Congress, fresh from the devastation of civil war, to spend millions on a vast frozen wilderness no one seems to want? That question would define the final act of Alaska's story. So, the decision in St. Petersburg was made. Alaska had to be sold. But sold to whom? The answer was obvious and dictated by the logic of 19th century world politics. Selling Alaska to Britain, Russia's primary rival, would have been more than illogical. It would have been strategic suicide. By the mid-1800s, Britain was the world's dominant superpower, the workshop of the world, and undisputed ruler of the seas. Its colonies encircled the globe. Directly east of Russian America lay Britain's vast Canadian possessions, administered by the powerful Hudson's Bay Company. On the other side of Eurasia, the British Lion, tightened its grip on India and forced its will upon China during the Opium Wars. Russia and Britain were already locked in the great game over Central Asia and had just clashed head-on in the Crimean War. Handing Alaska to London would have meant voluntarily straightening the empire's greatest geopolitical adversary, giving it near total control over the northern Pacific. That was unacceptable, which left only one realistic buyer: the United States. And here, the interest of St. Petersburg and Washington aligned in a surprisingly natural way. Both were young, expansionist powers. Both viewed Britain as their principal rival. The United States had not forgotten the War of 1812, when British troops burned Washington, D.C. Suspicion toward British influence, especially in Canada and the sea, remained strong. This shared British problem created solid ground for cooperation. Later, a curious story surfaced in European sources, no longer pure folklore, but a historical footnote worth examining. According to several accounts, before turning to Washington, Russia may have briefly explored the idea of selling Alaska to the Principality of Liechtenstein. The episode resurfaced in 2018 when a Swiss documentary revisited the topic, and Prince Hans Adam II of Liechtenstein confirmed in correspondence with the press that such a discussion had indeed occurred within the princely family. However, he also made it clear that the idea never progressed to formal negotiations. No treaties, draft agreements, or archival documents confirm any concrete talks. Historians therefore agree on one key point: the United States was the only country with which Russia conducted documented official negotiations over Alaska. But the timing could not have been worse. In 1861, the United States was plunged into the Civil War, a brutal conflict between the industrial North and the slaveholding South. Washington had little interest in acquiring distant glaciers while fighting for survival. And yet, paradoxically, that very war forged the Russian-American relationship in steel. While Britain and France watched the Confederacy with thinly veiled sympathy, hoping to see the United States weakened, Russia took a firm and singular position. It became the only major European power to openly support President Abraham Lincoln's government. In 1863, at the height of the war, Russian naval squadrons made a highly symbolic visit to New York and San Francisco. The message to London and Paris was unmistakable: intervene on the side of the South and you risk conflict with Russia as well. For the United States, this support was invaluable. This moment marked the true golden age of Russian-American relations, a rare period when the strategic interests of both nations aligned almost perfectly. But while diplomats toasted friendship, conditions on Alaska itself deteriorated rapidly. The American Civil War disrupted Pacific trade routes. Vital supply chains from California collapsed. Food shortages spread through the colony. At the same time, seeing the weaknesses of the already thin Russian presence, indigenous resistance intensified. Clashes became more frequent and more violent. Holding Alaska was no longer just expensive, it was dangerous. In St. Petersburg, this only confirmed the warning of Muravyev-Amursky and Grand Duke Konstantin. Alaska was not an asset, it was a growing liability, and it had to be dealt with as soon as the war in America ended. In the spring of 1865, the Civil War concluded with a Northern victory. The United States emerged stronger with a powerful army and industrial base, but financially exhausted, burdened by enormous national debt. It seemed absurd to imagine Washington spending millions on distant territory, but there were men in the American capital who thought in terms of the future, and in St. Petersburg there was a man ready to offer a deal he believed they could not refuse. The principal actors now stepped onto the stage. From the Russian side, Baron Edward de Stockel, ambassador to the United States. From the American side, Secretary of State William Seward. They were about to test an old truth. Everything has its price, even millions of acres of ice and stone. On December 16, 1866, a historic and strictly confidential meeting took place in St. Petersburg, chaired by Emperor Alexander II himself. Present were the key decision-makers of the empire: Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich, Foreign Minister Prince Alexander Gorchakov, Finance Minister Mikhail Ryotern, and Russia's envoy to the Washington, Baron Eduard de Stockel. It was Stockel, intimately familiar with American political realities, who delivered the hard truth. After testing the waters, he reported that there was little enthusiasm in the United States. The country had just emerged from a devastating civil war, economically exhausted and burdened with a massive debt. Its attention was fixed on the settlement of the Wild West and the development of California, not on purchasing a frozen wilderness in the far north. Many congressmen and senators viewed such a deal as a pointless waste of scarce funds. Stockel was given an almost impossible mission: to sell something no one wanted to buy. What was the solution? Pragmatic and unfortunately universal. Stockel spoke with striking frankness. To succeed, he said, two things were required. First, an active public relations campaign in the American press to present Alaska not as an ice chest, but as land of future promise. Second, and this was stated with a brutal honesty, according to our good old tradition, it would be necessary to distribute bribes to key members of Congress in order to secure approval of the deal. For these informal expenses, $120,000 was allocated, an enormous sum at that time. Stockel received his official mandate. Alaska was not to be sold for less than $5 million. To understand how modest that price was, a comparison helps. Only decades earlier, the United States had purchased Louisiana from France, a vast territory stretching from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains, for $15 million. Later, it paid Mexico the same $15 million for California alone. Against those deals, $5 million for Alaska seemed reasonable, if hardly inspiring. In early March 1867, Stockel arrived in Washington and went to work. His main ally and the driving force behind the deal on the American side was Secretary of State William Henry Seward, a committed expansionist who believed passionately in American Pacific future. Here we encounter one of the most persistent myths surrounding the sale. It is often claimed that the entire American public and press mocked the purchase, immediately branding it Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox. It is true that some newspapers, especially those opposed to the administration, were merciless. The New York Tribune called the deal a reckless extravagance. The New York World sneered, asking whether the United States just bought a squeezed lemon. Cartoons appeared depicting Seward and President Andrew Johnson hauling a massive block of ice labeled Russian America. There were even openly racist attacks, suggesting that America had purchased 50,000 Eskimos who supposedly ate half buckets of seal fat for breakfast. But this is only part of the story. Modern historians, analyzing dozens of leading newspapers of the era, show that the reaction was far more mixed. Many influential publications, especially on the West Coast, immediately hailed the acquisition of a brilliant bargain and a strategic masterstroke. They wrote about future dominance of the Pacific, rich fishing grounds, expanded trade with Asia, and the importance of weakening British influence in the region. Many politicians and businessmen clearly understood the long-term advantages. The myth of the universe in ridicule emerged later and was greatly exaggerated. Meanwhile, under conditions of absolute secrecy, direct negotiations between Stockel and Seward began on March 5, 1867. Demonstrating diplomatic cunning and fully aware that bargain was inevitable, Stockel opened not with 5 million, but with 7.2 million. For several weeks, intense discussion followed. Finally, during the night of March 29 and 30th, after an almost continuous negotiating session, an agreement was reached. The treaty was signed at 3:45 a.m. on March 30th, 1867. The final price, $7,200,000 in gold. It was a personal victory for Stockel, who had secured $2.2 million above the minimum price he was authorized to accept. But what exactly was signed in that pre-dawn hour? And which lands precisely ceased to be Russian in exchange for those millions? So, on March 30, 1867, a document was signed in Washington that permanently reshaped the map of North America. Now let's strip away the rhetoric and look at the treaty itself, at its dry, legal language, and calculate what exactly passed under the jurisdiction of the United States. For 7.2 million, the United States did not simply purchase a piece of land. It acquired an entire northern empire with its own geography, peoples, resources, and infrastructure. The treaty meticulously listed the territories transferred, the entire Alaska Peninsula, and all mainland territory west of the 141st meridian west longitude, a coastal strip 10 marine leagues wide along the western edge of British Columbia, the region we now call the Alaska Panhandle or Southeast Alaska. The Alexander Archipelago, a maze of more than 1,100 islands, all of the Aleutian Islands stretching like a broken bridge across the North Pacific, the islands of the Bering Sea, including the Pribilof Islands, the crown jewel of the fur seal trade, as well as St. Lawrence, St. Matthew, Ninivac, and others. Altogether, this amounted to approximately 1,518,800 square kilometers. That is more than France, Germany, and Italy combined. Break the price down, and the numbers become almost surreal. Roughly 4.7 cents per hectare, or about 2 cents per acre. Even by 19th century standards, when land still seemed endless, this was a symbolic price, borderline a gift. But a treaty is only paper. Sovereignty changes hands on the ground. The actual transfer took place later, on October 18, 1867 at 3:30 p.m. local time in Novoarkhangelsk, today Sitka. Russian and American troops lined up in ceremonial formation. The ritual of lowering one flag and raising another began. And this is where another beautiful and likely fictional story was born. According to one version, the Russian flag became tangled in the halyards and refused to come down, as if the land itself resisting letting it go. A sailor had to climb the pole to free it, allegedly under bayonet point. Another version claims the opposite, that the American flag became tangled during the hoisting, then tore apart in a sudden gust of wind. The official reports, however, are far less poetic. They describe a routine ceremony, flags exchanged under cannon salutes, documents formally handed over, polite handshakes between officers. The romance was added later by memory, rumor, and nostalgia. So what did the Russians take with them? Almost nothing, except people. Under the terms of the treaty, all immovable property of the Russian-American company, warehouses, barracks, shipyards, passed to the United States. The only exception was Orthodox church buildings, which remained Russian property. The legacy of the Russian Orthodox mission ran deep. Thousands of Aleuts and indigenous peoples had been baptized. That spiritual and cultural connection never disappeared to this day. Orthodoxy remains the second largest Christian denomination in Alaska. For ordinary Russian settlers, however, the transition was harsh. American troops entered Sitka almost immediately. The new authorities ordered Russian subjects to either accept American citizenship or leave the territory as soon as possible. Most chose departure. Homes, shops, years of accumulated property were often left behind, vulnerable to looting. Contemporary accounts describe soldiers ransacking private homes and even desecrating Orthodox churches, including the cathedral itself. By the end of 1867, the Stars and Stripes flew permanently over Alaska. The Russian Empire, which had founded the first settlements, charted the coast and ruled the region for over a century, had lost its final foothold in the New World. The ceremony may have been orderly, but the emotional storm that followed on both sides of the ocean was anything but. And from this seemingly straightforward financial transaction, a whole constellation of myth, regrets, and legends was about to be born. The deal was done. The flag was lowered. But how did ordinary people, readers, politicians, editors react in the two capitals that mattered most, Washington and St. Petersburg? The reactions were almost mirror images, though born in entirely different reasons. Let's go with America. Not laughter, but a split. In the United States, public reaction was far more complex than the familiar myth suggests. Yes, headlines mocked the purchase. Yes, the phrase Seward's Folly appeared. But the idea that everyone ridiculed the deal is simply false. This was the first major foreign territorial acquisition after the Civil War, and it divided the nation. For some Americans, especially in the war-ravaged East and South, Alaska looked like a pointless distraction, a frozen burden at a moment when the country desperately needed rebuilding. For others, particularly on the West Coast, the logic was crystal clear. Alaska meant dominance over the Northern Pacific, control of maritime roads, rich fisheries, and just as important, it blocked British Canada from expanding westward and hemming in the United States. Congress was fiercely divided. The debate was loud, bitter, and deeply political. And while arguments mattered, they were not the only tools used. As we've seen, persuasion in 19th century politics often involved methods that were anything but abstract. American public opinion was not a single course of ridicule. It was a battlefield, and in the end, the strategists defeated the skeptics. Let's go with Russia. Silence first, then shock. In Russia, the story unfolded very differently. The entire negotiation process had been wrapped in absolute secrecy. Alexander II's government understood perfectly well how the sale of imperial territory would be perceived and chose silence over explanation. Even after the formal transfer on October 18, 1867, St. Petersburg said almost nothing. Only in late October and early November, when foreign newspapers were already openly discussing the sale, did short, cautious notice begin to appear in Russian publication. The treaty itself was officially published only on October 8 Old Style, October 20th New Style by the Ministry of Finance newspaper. By then, Alaska had already been American for over a week. The reaction was explosive. Intellectuals, merchants, officers, many felt not pragmatic resignation, but humiliation. The sale was perceived not as a strategic necessity, but as a national loss. One of the most vocal critics, Andrei Krajewski, editor of the newspaper Golos, wrote bitterly,
"Must the labors of Shalaikov, Baranov, Klebnikov, and other self-sacrificing men of Russia really serve foreigners, who will now reap the fruits of their work?"
This sentiment echoed across society. The sale felt like a betrayal of the pioneers' legacy. A dark joke circulated in saloons and taverns alike. It's not a barn we sold after all. The criticism grew so intense that the government quickly chose to bury the topic, pretending nothing extraordinary had happened. And from this toxic mixture of secrecy, resentment, and disbelief, enduring myths were born. Myth 1. Alaska was only leased. The most persistent legend claims Alaska was leased for 99 years, not sold. This was psychological self-defense, a refusal to accept permanence. Similar arrangements existed elsewhere, most famously Hong Kong, and in the 1960s, when the supposed lease would have expired, the myth surged back to life. There is, of course, no such document. None has ever existed. Myth 2. The money never arrived. This myth comes in several flavors. One version claims Baron Edward de Stockel pocketed most of the money and distributed it entirely as bribes. Historians confirm lobbying expenses, but nothing close to the fantastical sums imagined later. Another version is more cinematic. According to legend, the gold payment was loaded in London into a Russian bark called Orkney, which then mysteriously sank in the Baltic Sea. Supposedly, a lone survivor lived to tell the tale. It's a beautiful story, but it's also false. What actually happened to the money? The archival reality is far more mundane and fully documented. Out of the 7.2 million, roughly 200,000 went to expenses, agent commissions, bank fees, lobbying, and payments to sympathetic journalists. The remaining 7 million were transferred through London to the Russian treasury. Converted at the contemporary exchange rate, this amounted to 11,362,000 rubles. And no, the money was not squandered on places or lost in court intrigue. Over 95% of the sum, about 10.9 million rubles, was spent on railway equipment and rails, directly supporting the massive infrastructure expansion of Alexander II reform era. Was this a fortune? In absolute terms, no. Annual imperial spending hovered around 400 million rubles. 11 million was a fraction, but in context, it mattered. After the Crimean War, Russia was desperate for cash, seeking foreign loans of over 45 million rubles. A large interest-free payment arriving all at once was a critical relief and helped finance the empire's transformation. Internationally, the loudest shockwaves came from London and Paris. British newspapers accused Russia and the United States of conspiring against the crown. The sudden straightening of America in the Pacific and the quiet formation of a Russo-American alignment was deeply unsettling. From this perspective, Seward's Folly looks very different. It was one of the first confident steps by the United States toward global power status, proof that its ambition extended far beyond continental borders. But was it really a folly? To answer that, we need to look past the editorials of 1867 and into the rivers, mountains, and frozen ground of this so-called icebox, because once the Russian ships sailed away, the Americans began to discover what had been hiding beneath Alaska all along, and that discovery would change everything. So what did the United States actually receive in exchange for that infamous icebox? The short answer is simple: one of the most profitable investments in human history. The purchase of Alaska paid for itself not once, not 10 times, but on a scale so vast that even William Seward's most optimistic supporters could never have imagined it. Just 3 decades after the deal, in 1896, everything changed. Gold was discovered in the Klondike, triggering one of the most dramatic gold rushes the world had ever seen. Soon followed the Nome Rush in 1898 and the Fairbanks Rush in 1902. Alaska, once marked as a frozen wasteland, became synonymous with opportunity, risk, and sudden fortune. Entire cities sprang up overnight. Steamships flooded the coast. Newspapers that had ridiculed the purchase now printed maps showing how to get rich. One of the most significant discoveries was the Juneau Gold Belt, named after prospector Joseph Juneau, which became one of the largest hard rock gold mining districts in North America. The numbers are staggering. Since mining began, Alaska has produced over 1,100 metric tons of gold. Today, the state consistently ranks second in the United States after Nevada, accounting for roughly 8–10% of national production, about 24 tons per year. The original purchase price of $7.2 million was repaid by gold alone many times over. If gold reshaped Alaska's image, oil reshaped its destiny. In 1968, geologists discovered the Prudhoe Bay oil field, one of the largest ever found in North America. To move that oil, engineers built the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, completed in 1977, stretching 1,300 kilometers from the Arctic Ocean to the ice-free port of Valdez. At its peak in the late 1980s, Alaska produced nearly 2 million barrels of oil per day, about 1/4 of total US output at the time. Today, production has declined, but remains substantial at 500,000–600,000 barrels per day, making Alaska the second largest oil-producing region in the United States after Texas. Proven reserves are measured in billions of barrels. In 2023, the US government approved development of the massive Willow project, with estimated reserves around 600 million barrels of oil, a reminder that Alaska's subsurface wealth is far from exhausted. And beneath that oil lies something potentially even more valuable: enormous natural gas reserves, still largely untapped, awaiting infrastructure and political will. Alaska is not only about gold and oil, it is also a global leader in zinc production. The Red Dog mine, located north of the Arctic Circle, is the largest zinc mine on Earth. Alone, it accounts for 5–10% of global zinc output and over half of the total value of all minerals extracted in Alaska. Alongside zinc, the state produces silver, lead, copper, and rare industrial metals, turning the former ice chest into a critical pillar of global supply chains. Perhaps the most remarkable outcome of Sewart's Folly isn't geological, it's social. In 1976, anticipating the oil boom, Alaskans voted to create the Alaska Permanent Fund, a sovereign wealth fund unlike anything else in the United States. By the law, 25% of all oil and mineral royalties flow directly into the fund. Since 1982, part of its investment income has been paid out as annual dividends to every permanent resident of the state. No conditions, no means testing. These permanent fund dividends, PFD, vary year to year, typically ranging from $1,000 to over $3,000 per person. In 2022, each resident received $3,284. For a family of 4, that's over $13,000 in cash, simply for living in Alaska. On top of that, Alaska has no state income tax, no state sales tax, one of the highest median household incomes in the country. Its economy rests on resource extraction, fishing, about 60% of all US seafood comes from Alaska, and tourism, industries built directly on the land acquired in 1967. Calculating Alaska's total economic return over 150 years is nearly impossible, but even the most conservative estimates place it at hundreds of billions of dollars. Gold and oil alone generated revenues thousands of times greater than the original purchase price. The icebox turned out to be a vault, a Folly, a masterstroke. What began as a controversial diplomatic gamble became a cornerstone of American economic power in the Pacific and the Arctic. And that brings us to the final and most uncomfortable question. What if Russia had kept Alaska? Could it have developed these riches itself? And what became of the territories Russia chose instead, places like Kamchatka, which remained under imperial control? That comparison tells a story even more revealing than the sale itself. "150 years later, the sale of Alaska still provokes a sense of regret in Russia. But to understand what that decision truly meant, we don't need speculation, we only need a map. Let's compare two neighboring territories that once shared similar starting conditions: harsh climate, rich seas, extreme remoteness, but ended up on opposite sides of history: Russian Kamchatka and American Alaska. Economy and standard of living. Alaska today is an economic donor and a strategic asset of the United States. Thanks to oil revenues and the Alaska Permanent Fund, its GDP per capita is among the highest in the country. The state directly shares resource income with its residents through annual dividends, typically $1,000 to $3,000 per person, and levies no state income tax. Kamchatka, despite its immense natural wealth, especially fisheries and seafood, remains a subsidized region. A significant portion of its budget consists of transfers from the federal center. Average incomes and overall quality of life are noticeably lower than in Alaska. Alaska has consistently invested in connectivity, a dense network of regional air roads, marine ferry systems, and developed road infrastructure in key areas. For a territory of such size and climate, internal mobility is surprisingly high. Kamchatka, by contrast, faces the full weight of geographic isolation. There is no land connection to mainland Russia. Air travel is not a convenience but a necessity, and an expensive one. This isolation directly affects prices, logistics, and everyday life. Alaska constitutionally enshrined the principle that natural resource wealth belongs not only to the state, but to the people. The Permanent Fund created a rare system of direct accountability where citizens visibly benefit from extraction. Kamchatka operates within the centralized Russian resource management framework. While revenues support the national budget, there is no direct mechanism that redistributes resource rent to residents in the way Alaska does. What this comparison really shows: this is not a competition and not a moral verdict. Kamchatka developed as part of a centralized state with its own historical logic, priorities, and constraints. Alaska, once sold, entered a completely different legal and economic reality, one that allowed it to maximize and localize the value of its resources. Was the sale a mistake? In hindsight, yes, considering what was later discovered beneath Alaskan soil. But in 1867, Russia shed a distant, vulnerable, unprofitable colony, gained immediate funds, and redirected its focus toward continental expansion in Asia. By the standards of its time, the decision was rational. For the United States, Alaska became more than a fortunate purchase. It became a symbol of expansion, a strategic outpost, and a unique social experiment, a place where natural wealth is directly tied to the well-being of citizens. Suvart's folly turned into a triumph of a long-term vision. History is often written backward. Words like genius or fatal mistake are born decades later, when outcomes are already known and consequences fully visible. In March 1867, there was neither genius nor folly. There was only a sober diplomatic agreement between two powers, each pursuing its own interests, one seeking to reduce risk, the other seeking future opportunity. Everything else came later. Thank you for watching this video to the very end. If you enjoyed it, please support the channel with a like, leave a comment, and share it with a friend. Thank you for watching. Kiss.